Welcome to the Port of Long Beach. I'm Mario Cordero, Executive Director of the Port of Long Beach. Today, I'll be speaking with Daniel Maffei, Chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission. Mr. Maffei was appointed as Chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission by President Biden in 2021, having served on the Commission since 2016. The Federal Maritime Commission, or FMC for short, is responsible for regulating the U.S. International Ocean Transportation System. Under his chairmanship, the Commission has reinvigorated its enforcement efforts, prioritized helping U.S. export shippers, and established several new initiatives to address supply chain congestion and efficiency challenges. Chairman Maffei's career in government spans more than 20 years. He was twice elected to the U.S. House of Representatives for the 24th Congressional District of New York, with assignments to the House Armed Services Committee, House Financial Services Committee, and the House Judiciary Committee. His earlier public service includes working for the Democratic staff of the House and Ways Committee as the press secretary for U.S. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Senator Bill Bradley. In addition to his career as a public servant, Chairman Maffei has worked in the private sector as an independent consultant and as a broadcast journalist. Dan, I'm looking forward to our conversation. As a former FMC chairman myself, I'm very happy to be speaking with you today and comparing some notes here. So why don't we get started? A few questions here, Dan. Question number one. President Biden signed the Bipartisan Ocean Shipping Reform Act, recently essentially giving the FMC more tools to regulate shipping as a way to control inflation. Can you share some of your plans?
Absolutely, Mario. First of all, I want to thank you for being on this and thank all of your viewers. Also, I should thank you for the very generous introduction, though part of it, of course, is because when you were chairman of the FMC, you actually recruited me as one of the commissioners. So I guess you're not completely independent of that. But look, we were very happy, I think, that President Biden signed this legislation, particularly given how bipartisan it was, and it is the first major changes to our ocean transportation legislation in 20 years, over 20 years. So it has a lot in it, and I think it does give us some more important tools. But it also does so in such a way that it lays out exactly the kinds of things that we need to be doing, and actually even a timeline for doing it, which is rather rare for legislation. So there's basically two things that we've been doing: immediate action and then rulemaking moving ahead. Some of the immediate action is we've issued notices to help make sure that the industry knows that there are certain elements of the new Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which I'll call OSRA, that are self-executing and that they have to comply with immediately, that there are certain things that we wanted to get out there that involve the spirit of the legislation and making sure that regulated entities do follow both the word and the spirit of the law. And then we've also established an interim process for filing charge complaints, since there are no now new various complaints. Also, and although some of this started before the legislation was actually signed, it's because we felt it would be signed that we've started reorganizing our enforcement, as you mentioned, intensifying it and making it different organizations within enforcement to deal with investigation and compliance. We've also placed an increased emphasis on consumer affairs and assistance. And what the legislation also does is authorizes quite a bit more funds to help us beef up some of these capabilities. In terms of rulemaking, there's many rules that that we can talk about. The first one, I guess, first major one is involves making sure that the carriers and other regulated entities do not refuse to deal, that they simply don't say that no exports, we're not going to do any exports at all. There has to be some sort of a valid reason. It can't just be an unreasonable thing, and we're working on that order as we speak. We had to start it within a very short amount of time, and right now we're dealing with a draft order, and I do expect in the next couple of weeks there to be a notice of proposed rulemaking on that. We've got several other things. We've got to get more into the detention and demurrage, all following the stuff that the FMC has already done in terms of the interpretive rule on detention and demurrage, which set forth the incentive principle that detention demurrage was not supposed to be, these charges weren't supposed to be a revenue source, but in fact designed to move cargo. But we're going to put some more meat on those bones, if you will. So there's a lot there, but we've got our work cut out for us.
So Dan, someone as a follow-up to the first question, this is we've gone to some rather interesting times, to say the least, particularly in the shipping industry. In regard to OSRA, how would it specifically help American businesses and consumers who have been facing escalating costs?
Well, I'm asked this a lot because there is nothing in OSRA that changes the overall structure of this industry in regards to regulating rates. The FMC was not allowed to regulate shipping rates before and is not allowed to regulate shipping rates directly now. What is different, though, is it gives us added teeth to really enforce the rules that we have and crack down on some of these fees and other kinds of ancillary charges that aren't necessarily adding any value. So we mentioned detention and demurrage. There's a lot on that. Also, additional fees such as congestion surcharges. Sometimes they call them peak season surcharges, sometimes even value-added surcharges, even though there's no value-added that we can see, that up the price, up the overall price, even though they're not part of the rate. And in my view, these are ways that regulated entities like carriers, will hide part of the rate in order to try to change or manipulate the market somewhat. Maybe not in a huge, massive way, but enough that they do make shipping cost more, and that cost is passed on to the average consumers. I also think that there are things in this bill that give the FMC added strength in terms of taking on some of the congestion issues. I was in New York City, which now is experiencing some of the problems that you did over on the West Coast, that you are still experiencing, but it's more serious now on the East Coast in terms of just a buildup of empty containers, and the carrier's unwillingness or inability to move those containers out, and that congestion actually creating even more problems. And in this case, in New York, because they won't move the empty containers out, there's no way that exporters can reach the container ships to get their exports out. So it builds on those problems, in a few ways that are direct and in many ways that are indirect, the legislation does give the FMC more teeth and more people, more strength in order to deal with these issues.
In the last couple years, the whole question of supply chain and supply chain constraints has been front and center here in the national discussion. And you may recall that the FMC, in fact, issued a report in July of 2015 on congestion/supply chain. But as you look at it now, Dan, what are the most challenging issues facing the shipping community and the supply chain?
Yeah, the interesting thing about that report, Mario, as you well know, I was not on the commission at the time, so I don't think I'm too biased in saying this. That report, well, of course, it could never have predicted the trends that would come from COVID, essentially laid out most of the problems that we're having now and why there are so many issues. However, unfortunately, nobody really listened to it. I'm not blaming the Democratic administration at the time or the Republican administration that followed it or the Democratic administration now, but when a report comes out from the FMC, it just didn't get the kind of play that one would hope. Look, the issues are very consistent, and that is there is a limit to what can be done on the ocean if the inland supply chain is failing us. You sort of compare it like a sink trying to drain water. At some point or another, if the pipes get clogged or if the pipes aren't large enough, the sink is going to fill up with water. You may even say, my sink is broken. You may call the plumber and say, my sink is broken. But what's really going on is not the sink. You don't throw away the fixture, it's the pipes. And a lot of what's happening with ocean shipping has to do with the overall system. And I'm not saying that there aren't any issues on the ocean side, that the carriers couldn't do better, that the terminals couldn't do better, that a number that even the port authorities couldn't do better. But a lot of it has to do with this overall system and infrastructure in the U.S. And I'm very, very pleased to say that a lot is being done about that. But beyond just strengthening the FMC, the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed last year, I believe, is going to do a lot, but it does take time. So there are a number of issues that we've been working on. And by we, I don't necessarily mean me. I mean you and other government officials in the past have been working on for some time. It's just that they were all exposed by COVID and the subsequent boom in demand of consumer goods that occurred afterwards. So hopefully now, I mean, it's unfortunate that a lot of people have had to suffer, but hopefully now that we know some of these issues and have gotten more information on them and more broad understanding of them, we'll be able to sort of fix them before the next big thing. And already we are starting to see a little bit prices start to come down in terms of rates. We're starting to see congestion lessen. As I said, New York now has, in the East Coast has some big problems, but you've done a lot of work on the West Coast that has eased congestion there. So a long way to go, but I do think we're making progress.
Some of us would like to say, Dan, as we look back, that when the FMC speaks, people should listen.
Yes, they should. They should.
As FMC chair, are you happy to see ports like the Port of Long Beach invest so much money for on-dock rail projects and other capital improvements?
Well, I've got a two-part answer on that. The first part is yes. I think these investments are absolutely necessary. And not only is the Port of Long Beach doing it, but I'm happy to say that a lot of your colleagues at other ports, even though they might be your competitors, they're also investing in this. And I actually think that's a good thing all around. The more rail links we have, the easier it is to reduce congestion. Of course, the links have to be to somewhere. And so inland facilities are very important to that as well. But also, and the other thing it does that the FMC doesn't regulate directly, but I care deeply about, is it reduces pollution. It reduces pollution and it reduces truck traffic on the streets. There'll be plenty of jobs for truck drivers. I have no doubt about that. But the more we can get on rail, particularly the short distances, that currently are not covered as much, the better. And the reason why, though, I have to have a two-part answer is because all the stuff you're doing, and I've seen it done at other ports, will unfortunately not come to much if we don't have more cooperation from the railroads. This is an area that the FMC doesn't directly regulate. We are in very close touch with some of our friends who do, such as at the Surface Transportation Board. But the fact is that what's going on with the rails is increasingly important to what's going on in terms of ocean shipping. And I do have to say that it is coming up short. The rail service is not, the demand is there, and yet we don't see it happening. So I'm increasingly interested as to why that's happening. I'm not saying that the rails are necessarily doing anything wrong or should be more heavily regulated at this point, but I do want to learn a lot more as to why, even when facilities are built and invested in by port authorities such as yourself, plus terminal operators in the public sector, how come they're not more heavily utilized?
Well, Dan, I fully agree with your comments. Wearing my hat as chairman of the American Association of Port Authorities, investing in our nation's port is in the best interest of our nation overall, be it the East Coast, be it the Gulf, or of course the West Coast. So I think, again, it's paramount that as a nation we continue the mindset that we have with this administration about how important those investments are in our nation's ports. Now, the cargo surge has led to federal investments in infrastructure projects that will improve ports across the country. What are the immediate and long-term benefits you see coming from these investments?
I think it's absolutely essential. I think that, I mean, you knew this when we first met long ago. I've been a big proponent of infrastructure for a long time, and though I was replaced I'm a Democrat. I was replaced by a Republican in my congressional seat. I'm glad to say that he and I had no disagreements whatsoever in terms of infrastructure and how it would affect the country in upstate New York. And he voted for all of that bipartisan infrastructure bill. So look, it's very, very important, and I've seen it as a congressman, and now I see it as Federal Maritime Commission chair, because again, we talked about the inland stuff. If the system will only be as strong as its weakest link. And unfortunately, we see that for a long time, the ports were, while not ignored, there was no separate title for them. And often because they're out of sight, out of mind, people didn't look at the ports. But it goes well beyond the ports. I mean, if you are investing in a new bridge in Tennessee, it still will help with port traffic as long as it's planned and designed correctly. So I think the holistic approach is really the thing that helps the most. But we do have a lot of work. It's not simply a matter of investment. First of all, the investment, as big as it is not enough. And figuring out how to move forward and how to leverage private sector investment is still going to be a big deal. But secondly, we need to make sure the incentives are right, and that's why I look at things like rail and even trucking. And I'm not necessarily blaming those industries, but I am going to question whether the incentives are correct, because when you do have such great demand for rail and yet it's not being accomplished, and the rail companies say they're doing their best and yet they're all making money. Well, maybe the incentives are off. So it is one thing that we're looking at. Now, you might say, well, the FMC doesn't have any jurisdiction over that, and we don't have any jurisdiction directly over the inland stuff. Well, that may be true, but we certainly do have jurisdiction over every container that goes on an ocean carrier and comes from an ocean carrier, regardless of where it is in that process. And that's one of the things I'm going to be saying in Chicago at the Inland Transportation Conference put on by the Journal of Commerce, is that contrary to what people think, the Federal Maritime Commission does not stop its interest and its jurisdiction at the water's edge. We are going to be looking at inland, and we're not going to be doing this as some sort of power grab. We're going to be working very carefully with our friends and other groups within government, including the DOT and various agencies there, and the Surface Transportation Board, which I mentioned earlier. But we are interested, and we're going to be looking at that, and that's a very important part of improving the overall process. In terms of the infrastructure bill, I mean, again, there's so much to do that it's hard to answer your question any more specifically, but because there's so much to do, I know it's going to be very, very important. It's frankly like water on a dry desert ground.
Well, Dana, I'm glad you mentioned the inland connectivity question. I think it's very important that when we address the supply chain, we keep in mind that, for example, when we mention containerized ports, a lot of people associate imports. But just as important is the export dynamic. And the FMC over the many years has been spoken with regard to the American shipper and what we need to do for the American exporter. So exports have been down since the surge of the cargo imports we've seen here in July 2020. And for the first 6 months of July, I think it's fair to say that most container port gateways were in the negative as it relates to imports. But at your direction, the FMC established the Export Rapid Response Team earlier this year. What do you hope to see this team to accomplish? Obviously, we're far from where we were in July 2020 or prior to that. A lot of import volume has come to all the nation's top container ports. But on the export question, what do you hope to accomplish by this team that the FMC has put together?
Yeah, the story on exports is always a little bit more complicated than maybe the headlines give. Overall agricultural exports have been up in the United States, but a lot of those are to Mexico and Canada, partly because ocean shipping has been so frustrating, and also they're not up compared to the amount of imports, and also they're not up compared to the opportunity that the agriculture sector has. Just as the demand for consumer goods went way, way up in the United States, the demand for United States products went way up in other countries. And yet we weren't able to really satisfy the demand, and particularly in the ag sector. Look, we're taking a two-pronged approach. One prong I already mentioned, which is the regulation. We're going to make sure that there aren't carriers out there that are just dismissing exports and saying, well, we're not going to take exports. it's not important to us, and we don't feel like we have any responsibility to take them at all. And we're not even going to negotiate or anything like that. That sort of, if it is an unreasonable refusal, we're going to make sure we go after that. And in the meantime, we're going to encourage the carriers, as many have already established, to have export plans and programs that exporters can figure out and help utilize. And I've seen, I won't mention any names, I guess, but I've seen several carriers do this, and I'm very confident that they are working both to help the exporter and, frankly, to help the carriers establish more of a two-way profit center. So it's not just making money on bringing in the imports, but also making some money on bringing exports from the United States to other countries. But the second thing is that we have to acknowledge that a good portion of the reason why there's such a problem with exports, particularly with agriculture exports, is the logistics. They, particularly in this crisis, they haven't been able to get the containers they need in the right place, while containers have been piling up at your port and across the bay at LA and in places like New York and even in Savannah, Georgia. The containers we're not getting, and they're, to a certain extent, are still not getting to the interior where they're needed by agriculture exporters. They're not able to predict, particularly in a time of great congestion, when they're supposed to get their stuff to the ships. They get a earliest return date, a particular date they're supposed to show up by, but that shifts around. They end up maybe getting the containers there too early, in which case they have to pay storage, and potentially the goods rot, or at least are not, their usable life is reduced, or they get there too late, in which case you've got a whole other set of problems. So figuring out those logistics and walking, helping to walk exports through that, that's what we're trying to do at the FMC. I've sort of put the old constituent service hat on that I used to have as a congressman. They said, look, what if these were my constituents? And in a very real sense, I feel that they are my constituents. What would I do? Well, I would advocate for programs for them, but I would also do casework. I would also pick up the phone and have my staff pick up the phone and try to help them. And so we're going to try to do that. Are we going to be able to help everybody? Unfortunately, no. But are we going to be able to help a few? Yes. And in helping some people, we're going to figure out more exactly what some of the issues are, and that'll hopefully inform our policy and the policy of the administration as we advise them.
Well, Dan, this is my last question.
You know,
the Los Angeles Dodgers will be representing the National League in this year's World Series. In your opinion, who should be the American League representative?
Well, first of all, I was going to compliment you, Mario, on not creating some sort of controversy. And unfortunately, my New York Yankee cap is in the other room, and I'm tempted to run and get it, but I won't do that in the interest of comedy. The Yankees, should be there. Got to make sure that our injuries, are not serious, and that we keep ourselves together. Obviously, we had a better beginning of the season than recently, but the Yankees are still holding their own, and I strongly believe they'll be in the World Series, and I hope it is against the Dodgers. And then, we'll make sure that you and I can attend some of the games. However, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to force you to buy me tickets because you're in a semi-regulated entity now, so we'll have to buy our own tickets. But I think it's a good look. It's the tradition, Yankees versus the Dodgers. It's, that goes back since the Dodgers were, in a real city like Brooklyn. And so we want to make sure that that continues, that rivalry.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I certainly look forward to that World Series ideal game that is.
I will say that I noticed that you didn't pick up an Angels mug. So I don't know what that says to your fellow Californians.
Well, I think the Dodgers have a winning tradition for a reason. I am a fan of the Angels, but I think the Angels have a lot of work to do here. But in that regard, I'm looking forward to the Dodger-Yankee World Series. And with that, Mr. Chairman, let me just last say, I appreciate, as an industry, we appreciate your leadership in these very challenging times with regard to the supply chain and congestion and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, as we always like to say or raise the cliche, crisis brings the opportunity. And I think this crisis has really raised the opportunity for people to recognize what the FMC's mission has been over the many, many years, its tradition. And again, if there was ever a need to have an FMC and a strong FMC, it is now. And so we appreciate your leadership with all that you're addressing.
Yeah. And Mario, may I say that your leadership at the Port of Long Beach and the leadership over at the Port of LA, and I know you guys have worked closely together. You are the biggest gateway to the United States. I might make fun of the Los Angeles area when it comes to baseball, but the truth is, it's absolutely essential. And you've done so much good work. I think working with John Percari the administration to make sure that cargo is moving really in the depth of the crisis. And one thing I will point out, it's true about the port of Long Beach and LA and New York and all these ports, and particularly of their workers. They never closed. Not once in this crisis did anyone ever stop unloading cargo and loading cargo. And that's one of the reasons why our economy remained in relatively decent shape, particularly compared to the rest of the world. And so you've done a lot of good work, and I will continue to consider you a mentor and do my best to follow your wisdom.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you for those kind words. And again, we appreciate your time, given that you have a very busy agenda here. So with that, we'll talk more. And next time you come to the West Coast, look forward to giving you a tour of the St. Peter Bay complex along with my colleague at the Port of LA. So again, thank you so much, Chairman.
All the best. Thank you, Mario.